All right, we're here with the great Greg Cosell, returning to the show.
First time, I think. Champion?
You're back. Friend of the show, you're back. And first time, I think, on Check the Mic, our new show. So welcome. How's everything going?
Everything's great. It's always good seeing you guys,
Always appreciate having you.
Twice a year, Super Bowl and Combine.
Yeah, right,
exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
And talk draft prospects when we get there. We'll get into that some of that in a minute. But Hall of Fame voting came out last night. It was a more difficult class to get into. Do you have any initial thoughts on the class?
Only 4 getting in. Did that surprise you?
It did.
Yeah, me too. Me too. I was kind of surprised. We were talking last night, because to me the big discussion, which obviously they didn't feel he should get in, was Eli Manning. Because just when you hear people talk, I got the sense he was going to be a first ballot Hall of Famer.
Yeah.
Right or wrong. We can get into that. But that's the sense I got from a lot of people who are voters, that he'd be a first ballot Hall of Famer. And obviously it's not the case.
Yeah, I mean, they've changed the sort of system, right, this year and made it more restrictive and changed how the voting works exactly.
Right.
It feels like they are trying to make it a more restrictive, difficult to get into, higher barrier for entry. And I think, generally, I think that makes sense. I actually think it should be a higher barrier, but they've sort of it's too late. They've already let in some of these guys that wouldn't make the category if under the new system. So I sort of feel like you can't do it now. You either did it to begin with, or you do it. You don't do it, and you do what Dion suggested, which is to have a sort of a penthouse of the Hall of Fame, where you get the true, superstars from all time.
And I think because the game has changed over these last 10, 15, 20 years, there are certain positions like wide receiver where you're going to see numbers. And that becomes a more difficult decision, when guys retire that have big numbers. Are they Hall of Fame players? And again, that's a very subjective thing. We might, all three of us could see it totally differently what Hall of Fame means.
Right.
But then you get players who may be in the top 10 in terms of receptions and yards, and during their career, maybe none of us would think they're Hall of Famers. But yet when they retire, the numbers say, wow, there's only 8 guys who had better numbers in the history of the sport. And that's certain positions, I think, start to get difficult.
Yeah, the fact that the numbers just keep escalating it makes it difficult. But we were looking on Twitter last night on the way back from dinner at sort of the various tweets about Eli Manning in particular.
Right.
One guy put it in an interesting way that I hadn't seen before. When Eli retired, he was like 6th or 7th, I think, on every sort of significant list. But the way they phrased it was, amongst players whose career he overlapped with, he was 10th or 11th. So when you start factoring in the guys that come, immediately after him or along with him and last a little longer, suddenly his career starts to look a little bit, less rosy just statistically. Where do you think Eli is in terms of the Hall of Fame debate?
Yeah, and I think that's it's funny. I don't know if it's a hard question for me, and of course, I always feel like I have to say none of this is personal, because it's not. But he won 2 Super Bowls, okay, and that's why my sense was in talking to people, going back 2-3 months, I guess when the initial group was announced, that's the first thing they say is he won 2 Super Bowls, and you can't separate that. But and we were talking about this last night, that if you do separate it, his career, for the most part, was probably average. And again, he played a long time, so he'll put up numbers. But I think he won exactly the same number that he lost, if I'm not mistaken. I think he finished 500. Yep. He led the league in interceptions 3 times. That to me, that's not a Hall of Fame career, just when you look at the big body of work. But because he won 2 Super Bowls, and there's no question he was a driving force in winning those playoff games and winning the Super Bowls, that's where the issue comes in. But I don't think his overall career and body of work says Hall of Fame.
I like the idea of the penthouse idea.
Yeah.
Let's just play you play word association. Is he a Hall of Famer? And if you say yes immediately,
yeah, and that's a lot of people.
I like that game.
I went through that with baseball because I was a baseball guy. You were obviously too. And I remember when I really followed baseball more closely than I do now. I used to have these discussions with people, and they'd say, "Is so and so a Hall of Famer?" And if you have to stop and think about it, in your mind, he's not.
Yeah.
Right. But we were talking last night about Matthew Stafford, who's obviously still playing and plans to play this year. Assuming he still plays well, there's no reason to suggest he won't. He's going to have ridiculous numbers by the time he might be top 5.
Yeah.
And he won a Super Bowl. So he's going to be sort of the next guy. Is he a Hall of Famer, of these kinds of quarterbacks? And, I think you could make the argument easily that just from a body of work career-wise, he's much better than Eli Manning.
Would you put him over Eli?
I would.
Yeah.
But, again, I don't know how you guys feel.
I think Stafford's still a no for me.
Right.
I mean, if he went on another Super Bowl run where he's the driver again like he was in 21, maybe, he's a no for me, though.
Let me ask you this. Like, where do you stand on Dan Fouts and Warren Moon? Who are both
Fouts was like a top 3 guy for a while in his generation, wasn't he? I mean, I didn't get to see him play, live or anything. And Moon was more of an accumulator.
It's not often that we get to say it's a little bit before our time.
Right.
Thanks for coming on, Greg.
Not before my time, unfortunately, yeah.
We got Will from social...
Because I'm still here talking about it, so that's a good thing.
We're talking to social media Will over here about songs from 2000. He was like, oh, yeah, I was born that year. It's really humbling.
I can go back to songs from the 70s. That's the music I listen to.
Well, Fouts and Moon, where are they for you?
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. Ron Jaworski and I used to have this conversation all the time. Like, he didn't think that either one should be in the Hall of Fame. He thought they were really good players. And, and obviously Fouts was somewhat cutting edge because of Don Coryell, the Air Coryell, which sort of started in St. Louis when he was the head coach in 73 to 77 with Jim Hart. And they started putting up passing numbers that really the league had not quite seen before. We saw them in the AFL, which was a different league. But in the NFL, in the 60s, everybody wanted to be Vince Lombardi. And, in the 70s, here comes Coryell. And I don't know if you guys know the story with Coryell. Coryell began his career basically as a run guy. And then he got the head coaching job at San Diego State in maybe, 63, 64. And back then, San Diego State was playing the Pac-8. It was the Pac-8. And he wasn't going to get the same players that the Pac-8, because at that time, the Pac-8 might have been the best conference in the country. But he had to play against them. So what he decided to do is he couldn't compete by beating them up physically because he wasn't getting those guys. So he said, how can I play against them and compete? And he said, I'm going to have to spread it out and throw the ball. Wow. And that's how the passing game really – and you could also bring in a transfer on Tuesday and he could play on Saturday. So he created that offense, the Air Coryell offense, the number system, because he'd bring in a guy and he'd say, okay, you're going to line up on the left and you're going to run 3 routes. And we're going to number them. 9's going to be a go route. 8's going to be an in-breaker. Yeah, whatever. Yeah. And that's how he came up with the system, but that's how it all started. So my point is about Fouts is he was sort of kind of cutting edge in the NFL with the Coryell system, and I think that's probably why he got in, because he put up those ridiculous numbers in kind of a new system.
Could I use a similar argument on
Sure.
Joe Montana, Steve Young, and Brett Favre, the West Coast offense through the 80s and into the 90s when everyone else is throwing the ball down the field and they're completing 60. Remember, 60% completions used to be a big milestone in a given season.
56-57 was considered great.
Yeah, I'm dropping Montana, Young, Favre system quarterback takes over here today.
Right.
I mean, but I'm just saying. I think a lot of and you have Jerry Rice. I'm just saying maybe their stats inflated as well.
Well, it gets to the argument that if you're a really good quarterback, usually you have pretty good receivers too. Yeah.
I think Steve's now the gatekeeper for the penthouse suite of the Hall of Fame. It's like the only person in there, it's Tom Brady and Dion and Jerry Rice are the only people up there.
Right.
Everyone else just in the regular Hall of Fame.
Yeah.
But what I find really fascinating about the Eli thing is because he has 2 Super Bowls, like he's this unique case where his 2 Super Bowls are almost a total outlier relative to everything else in his career.
Without question.
Whereas other guys, like Peyton Manning got one early, and then the second one was sort of validation. Right. It's like he was this good. Finally, we got a second ring.
And he wasn't a huge factor even that whole season.
Right. But the second one was just like, this is what he should already have had. Right. And then John Elway, when he finally got his, it's like finally Elway's got the
very
rings.
Late in his career.
Yeah, that he should have had all along, and we can move on.
And it's funny you say that. Obviously, Elway was in 3 Super Bowls prior, but until 1993, when Jim Fossil became the offensive coordinator in Denver, Elway had thrown more touchdowns and interceptions in like the first 10, 11 years of his career. His completion percentage wasn't very good. Yeah. Everybody knew his talent, and we talk about this all the time, talking about college prospects, traits and attributes, characteristics. Obviously, people saw a guy that was different than quarterbacks before him. But, the numbers were not very good at all.
Right.
He was not an efficient player.
But with those other guys, the Super Bowls kind of became the validation to the rest of their career that was already really good. Whereas with Eli, it's like you've got this average career that if you take away the rings would not even be talked about as a Hall of Fame career. Like it wouldn't. It would be Vinny Testaverde. It would be somebody that was just okay in the league for a long time, right?
Right.
But then you have 2 championship campaigns where he played completely differently. In 2007, he knocks off, the greatest team that's ever played, an undefeated team in the Super Bowl to end that and win the first one. And then that 2011 run might be the greatest sustained play in the face of serious pressure I've ever seen from a quarterback. So
with iconic plays, individual plays that everybody remembers. The throw to Manningham, which was a
incredible throw.
To me, it was the throw more than the catch.
Yeah.
I mean, and then the touchdown to Burris, which obviously was a blitz, and they went sluggo and all. But still, there's iconic, and obviously the Tyree play. You can't forget that. But so there's iconic plays that will go down in history. We'll be talking about him in the next 20, 30 years.
Yeah, so it's not like he was just an average quarterback that stumbled into a couple of championships, that's the validation. It's like he was an average quarterback who then had 2 incredible Super Bowl runs that he was driving that won 2 championships.
Right.
So I think you can make a case that Eli Manning is a Hall of Famer, but the case is just those 2 runs. Like everything else is irrelevant. It's just those.
And there'll be people who say that that's enough. Because you know what? What's the goal? To win Super Bowls. So they'll. And by the way, I don't necessarily have an argument with that. But your point's correct. The rest of the career was average.
Nick Foles, Hall of Fame. Nick Foles, 20. One more ring for Nick. He had a great 2013 regular season and a great 2017 2-game playoff run. The first game wasn't great. 2-game playoff run, which was unbelievable. We talked about the receivers a little bit earlier on. Torrey Holt's not getting in.
Yeah.
Jimmy Smith not in. Can you educate our viewers and listeners on how good those guys were at receiver?
See, there's a perfect example. To me, you're dealing with just 2 masters of the position. And I know maybe that's not what voters vote on, but I think if you speak to people in the game, people that had to play against them, and I've done this, my career at NFL Films, I used to do a ton of interviews. I don't do that anymore. But there was a long stretch where I just did a ton of interviews with players, coaches, personnel people. And I can remember speaking to defensive backs that played against Jimmy Smith, and they talked about him almost, you would have thought they were talking about Jerry Rice, the way they spoke about Jimmy Smith.
Yeah.
And, again, he'll never get a sniff at the Hall of Fame. But he was thought of by people who played against him as almost godlike. And then Torrey Holt, to me, he was just a master of the position. It was one of those guys that just was understood every detail, nuance, subtlety, discipline of the position. I think he got lost in the greatest show on turf because Isaac Bruce was there, and Isaac Bruce was just a naturally more explosive player, and he's in the Hall of Fame. And obviously they had Marshall Faulk, and they had Warner, and you start getting in Orlando Pace, and you start getting into how many guys from a given team in a given era can be in the Hall of Fame. That's another question, because I've had these conversations with Hall of Fame voters. They think about that. Well, how many guys can you put in from that team? So they sort of so Torrey Holt kind of loses out on the merits. Putting aside whether we think he should be or not, he loses out because they think, there's too many guys from that team.
That stuff is where I think the process gets stuck in the mud. It's
right.
Like that should be irrelevant.
I agree with you.
Now, I also I agree big picture terms that if you're putting in 15 guys from a single team, something else has gone wrong. But you shouldn't be keeping a guy out of the Hall of Fame because you think we've already put in too many people from this team. It's like, theoretically the term generational, right, should be sort of once a generation, once every 10, 15 years. Everyone does. But the point is, just because theoretically it's supposed to be every 15 years or so, doesn't mean that 2 generational guys can't come along one year after another, right? If you were going, well, he can't be generational because the guy a year ago was generational. I mean, it's possible they both are.
Right.
J.J. Watt and Aaron Donald came along a couple of years after each other.
Sure.
They were both 2 of the greatest defensive players to ever play.
It's funny you say that because I know I've had this conversation too. I mean, Sal Palantonio is a Hall of Fame voter, good friend. We work together. And, he always would talk about the Patriots defenses, for all those years under Belichick, where they had great defenses.
Right.
And he'd say, well, more people need to be in the Hall of Fame because those defenses were so good. And then you started looking at the individual players, and while they were really, good players, are you putting them in just because they were on a good defense?
Yeah.
You start getting caught up in that argument too.
So, in your opinion,
with a great coach.
Right.
Yeah, like system was a big part of that, obviously. I mean, Belichick was arguably the greatest defensive coach of all time.
And you know what? I don't have an issue with that because everybody coaches a system. Look, we know Patrick Mahomes is an all-timer, and he's on his way to being a first-ballot Hall of Famer, and no one's going to argue that he's not a great player. That's not the point. But I think a lot of people do believe that Andy Reid had a lot to do with how he was able to develop so quickly into being what he is. And I'm not going to sit here and say, well, if he wasn't with Andy Reid, he wouldn't be any good. I'm not going to say that.
Right.
First of all, it's a total unknown, and it would sound foolish now given what he's accomplished. But, coaching, all that kind of stuff matters. You just mentioned coaching with the Patriots. I mean, that stuff matters. Joe Montana, that's the classic debate, about the Bill Walsh, Joe Montana. And don't forget, Walsh, prior to that, when he was with the Bengals and Virgil Cook got hurt, Greg Cook got hurt, who at the time was considered as gifted, almost Bradshaw gifted before Bradshaw. And then he got hurt, and he had to totally change his offense because of Virgil Carter and develop that whole West Coast because they couldn't run it. Who knows?
Nobody operates in a vacuum. Every one of these people is relying on somebody else in order for them to be as great as they are.
That's absolutely
true.
You
go through all the people in the Hall of Fame. Most of them were either on great units, were coached by great coaches, were paired with a great quarterback. All these things are necessary in order for you to be as good as you are.
Dan Fouts, we mentioned him earlier. Dan Fouts for those early years, it was Winslow, it was John Jefferson, who had 3 ridiculously great years. And then they had Wes Chandler, who, by the way, some thinks like a top 5 receiver of all time just in terms of his abilities. And then he had Charlie Joyner. Chuck Muncie, who, if he didn't have other issues, off-the-field issues, another guy who people thought could have been a top 5, 6'3", 235. People think he could have been one of the greatest running backs of all time. Unfortunately, he got caught up in the drug culture.
So, in your opinion, who is the best player not currently in the Hall of Fame?
Oh, my God. That's a very open-ended question. That's too hard. Well,
name some.
God. Because I can't even remember all the guys in the Hall of Fame. I need a list to work with on that. Yeah.
Let me ask you something different related to the game.
Yeah.
Steve Spagnuolo and everything that he has done.
Right.
With the Giants as defensive coordinator and now with the Chiefs, not so much is he a Hall of Famer. Is he a Hall of Famer, but just how good is Spags? Is he, in the Belichick tier as far as defensive coaches now with what he's accomplished?
Without question, in my mind.
Yeah.
And don't forget, he's done it differently with different teams. You go back when he had that great D-line against the Patriots in the first Super Bowl. He was not a heavy blitz guy back then. He always had cool pressures. That's his. But, Belichick's done it. Spags has done it with a lot of different people, a lot of different teams, different ways. He's just really, really good. And it's funny, even now, as you guys know, he's not, relative to the rest of the league, a high percentage blitzer just in terms of numbers, but he's just so good situationally. And I don't know how you do that. Obviously, I'm not a coach. I'm never going to know how you do that. But to me, that's his genius, is how, you think back, and this is just a small sample, to the playoff game against Houston when they got to the fourth quarter. Those 3 pressures in a row with like 12 minutes to go, and I think it was a one-score game, might have been 2012.
Yep.
And he had those 3 pressures in a row. He's just so good at that.
Yeah, Mahomes is a great closer.
Yeah.
Spags is also a great closer,
yes,
right? And so
absolutely.
they have that 1-2 punch of both of those guys.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Super Bowl wise, you got a prediction for the game?
Well, I'm on record already, so because I've done.
You could change it. You can just change it whatever you want.
Right.
You're always right.
Well,
what do you got?
And as you guys probably are the same because you watch a ton of tape like I do, so there's 15 different variables in this game, so it's very hard to pick. But I'm on record as picking the Eagles 31-27. I just have a feeling it's going to be a little more high scoring. The only thing that maybe prevents me from thinking a little more high scoring is if there's longer drives, which there could be in this game, then obviously that eats up some time and maybe you don't get, as much. But I don't know. I just keep coming. We were talking about this last night. Back to that O-line. That O-line to me, and it's no knock on the Chiefs D-line. I think it's good. I think they've got a lot of movable pieces, unknown players maybe to the average fan, like the Michael Danas of the world, the Omenahus, all these guys that can line up in multiple spots. And Tranquil, to me, is a really good linebacker. But that O-line, that's 1,700-plus pounds over the course of 4 quarters. Doesn't it seem inevitable every game that Barkley's breaking a 50-yard touchdown?
Yes.
Like you're just waiting for it. Whether it's play one, like the NFC Championship game, or in the third quarter. You're just kind of waiting for him to break a 60-yard touchdown.
Smallest crease. Give him a crease, and he can do it. On the turf here, he did it on this turf in New Orleans earlier in the year.
Yeah,
a couple big plays.
By the way, before they really knew what their team was, it was early in the fourth quarter. It was week 3. The Eagles weren't certain what their offense was going to be. It was one of those ugly games up to that point. But, it's funny. That play is so reflective to me of the Eagles' offense and the layers that it has. Because you've got the zone read element with Hurts. You've got the inside zone with Barkley on every play. On that particular long run, they had the screen outside, which pulled, run support.
Yep.
I mean, they have a lot of layers to their offense in the run game. It's not just, let's knock people, let's knock them on their backs. There's a lot of elements. They do a lot of things.
Last thing I wanted to ask, we've asked other people around the league. With all the film, this is a good film question.
Yeah, okay.
You like this. With all the film you're watching, what was going on this year? It felt like certain offenses in particular, very confused up front with stunts, twists, pressures. Yes. What was happening differently, do you think, from a defensive perspective and an offensive perspective?
I don't think there's a way to truly quantify this, but I think that the less time you spend in the offseason with O-line cohesion, the more difficult it is for O-linemen to work together.
Yeah.
And I think that picking up stunts, pressures, particularly as more teams use defensive backs as pressure players, which of course Spags is a master at, but as more teams do that, it gets harder and harder to protect. And I think that's one thing that really stood out. Along those lines, I'm curious to see if we continue to see, an incremental emphasis on the run game, because it just gets harder to pass protect. And I remember having a great conversation years ago with John Gruden, and one of the first things he said when we were talking, he says, you can't throw the ball if you can't protect. I mean, it sounds, really simple, but it's true.
Yeah.
Because everything can't be a 3-step drop, So, but I think you're seeing O-lines that are just, and a veteran coach who's a very good friend of mine, coaching the league for 35-plus years, he texted me maybe a couple of weeks ago and said, I can't believe how bad pass protection is in the league. And I think, it's my guess is one reason would just be the way the offseason is now with the collective bargaining agreement. I mean, that takes a lot of work. You guys know that.
Yeah.
That takes a lot of work. And you could just see even basic stunts that seem, it's easy for us sitting here, or watching with a clicker, to act like. But
it's easy relative. They're expected to be able to pick it up.
They are expected to pick that up. And they had a lot to problems with that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So it was a big trend that we saw this year. And we've been asking a lot of people, where do you think it's coming from? It's a good one.
Yeah. So.
Well, Greg Cosell, always a pleasure.
It was fun, guys.
Enjoy the rest of the week here and enjoy the Super Bowl.
Yeah, it was great being with you guys. Thanks.
Thank you.